There is a quiet covenant we make with the world when we choose to live in the suburbs. It's an unspoken agreement, a shared belief in the illusion of safety. We build our lives on cul-de-sacs and tree-lined streets, places where the loudest sound is often the Sunday morning lawnmower, and the biggest drama is a neighborhood barbecue. We see the painted shutters, the manicured lawns, the family minivans, and we believe we are insulated from the true darkness of the world. We tell ourselves that monsters don't live here. They exist in far-off cities, in news headlines from another state, in the fictionalized horrors we consume on our television screens. But the most terrifying truths are often the ones we refuse to see, the ones that fester silently behind the very doors we pass every single day. The truth is that evil doesn't have a specific address. It doesn't respect zoning laws. And sometimes, the most unimaginable monster isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but the person you love most in the world, the person you raised, the person you tucked into bed at night, the person for whom you would do anything. This is a story about that kind of love, a mother's fierce, unwavering devotion that collided with a son's catastrophic descent into madness. It is a story of a promise made in desperation and a crime so brutal, so meticulously monstrous, it would forever stain the pristine image of a quiet American community. This is the deeply disturbing and profoundly tragic case of Ramsay Scrivo. Our story unfolds in St. Clair Shores, Michigan, a city that embodies the Midwestern ideal. It's a place defined by its relationship with water, sprawling along the western shore of Lake St. Clair. It's a community of boaters and blue-collar families, of local diners and high school football games. It is, by all measures, a good place to live, a safe place. And in a modest condo within this safe community lived 60-year-old Donna Scrivo. If you were to paint a portrait of a caregiver, you would paint Donna. She was a registered nurse, a profession that was not just a job for her, but a calling. It was in her DNA to nurture, to heal, to comfort. Her colleagues at the hospital described her as compassionate to a fault, always the first to take an extra shift, the one who would hold a patient's hand long after her duties were done. She possessed a quiet strength, the kind forged through a lifetime of putting others before herself. This dedication extended far beyond the hospital walls. Her true life's work was her family. She was the mother of 2 sons, Jason and Ramsay. Her older son, Jason, had moved out and was building his own life, a source of quiet pride for Donna. But her younger son, 32-year-old Ramsay, still lived with her, and Ramsay was her greatest joy, her heaviest burden, and her deepest fear. To understand the tragedy that was to come, you must first understand the man Ramsay Scrivo once was, and the man he had become. In his youth, Ramsay was bright. More than bright, he was promising. He was articulate, good-looking, and possessed a natural charisma. He had earned a degree in business administration from a local university. He was the kind of son any mother would be proud of. But as he entered his late 20s, a shadow began to fall over him. It was a subtle shift at first, a change in his personality that was easy to dismiss as eccentricity or moodiness. But the shadow grew, lengthening and darkening until it had consumed the young man Donna knew. The vibrant, intelligent son she had raised was being systematically erased, replaced by a stranger living in his skin. A stranger who was paranoid, volatile, and lost in a terrifying world of his own making. Ramsay was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a cruel and debilitating mental illness. It's a devastating diagnosis, essentially combining the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia, hallucinations, paranoia, delusional thinking, with the severe mood episodes of bipolar disorder. For Ramsay, this meant his reality had fractured, his mind had become a prison, and its architect was a relentless persecutory delusion. He became convinced that he was being hunted by a vast, powerful, and sinister cult. This wasn't a fleeting thought. It was the central organizing principle of his entire existence. He saw the cult's symbols everywhere, in logos on television, in the patterns of floor tiles, in the gestures of strangers. He believed they were monitoring his every move, listening to his thoughts, and plotting to destroy him. His paranoia became a physical force in the home he shared with his mother. He would spend days barricaded in his bedroom, convinced the cult had infiltrated the house. He would cover the windows, jam the door shut, his fear palpable. The very people trying to help him became his enemies. In his twisted reality, his own family, including the mother who was sacrificing everything for him, were potential members of the conspiracy sent to harm him. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and frightening. He would have explosive outbursts of rage, his voice booming through the thin condo walls, followed by periods of withdrawn, catatonic silence. Donna, the nurse, the mother, found herself on the front lines of a war she couldn't possibly win. She lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror. Ramsay was a grown man, physically imposing, and his actions were unpredictable. Yet, she refused to abandon him. This was her son, her blood, her responsibility. She poured every ounce of her energy into trying to save him. She pleaded with him to take his antipsychotic medications, which he often refused, believing they were poison sent by the cult. She drove him to countless psychiatric appointments, often having to coax and bargain with him just to get him in the car. She endured his wild accusations, his paranoid rages, and the heartbreak of seeing the son she loved disappear before her very eyes. She confided in her close friends and family, her voice heavy with exhaustion and fear. She told them she was scared, not just for Ramsay's sanity, but for her own safety. In early January of 2014, just weeks before the end, she had a conversation with a friend that, in hindsight, was chillingly prophetic. She explained that Ramsay's delusions were escalating. He was having visions. He was convinced the cult was now operating out of their very home, that they were using the condo as a base of operations. The fear in her voice was raw, but so was her determination. Her friend listened as Donna spoke the words that would come to define her final act of love. She said, "I'm going to get him the help he needs, or I'm going to die trying." She could not have known how literally that promise would be fulfilled. The last time any of Donna Scrivo's friends or family saw her alive was on Saturday, January 25, 2014. She had completed her shift at St. John Hospital, the familiar routine of her life providing a small anchor in the chaotic storm at home. She drove back to her condo, back to Ramsay, and then she vanished. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling silence. Donna was the hub of her family's wheel. She was a constant communicator, always checking in. When her phone started going straight to voicemail, alarm bells began to ring. Her older son Jason called again and again. No answer. He texted. No reply. He called Ramsay, who was evasive and unconcerned. He offered vague, nonsensical stories. First, he said she had gone out. Then, he said she had packed a bag and left, just walked away from her life without a word. For anyone who knew Donna Scrivo, this was an impossibility. She would never leave without her purse, her cell phone, her car. She would never abandon her job. And most of all, she would never, ever leave without telling her family. The concern in Jason's gut began to curdle into a cold, hard dread. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. By Friday, January 31st, a full week after Donna was last seen, the family could bear the silence no longer. A relative went to the condo on Cove Street to check on her. They found Ramsay there, alone. The relative noticed two things immediately. First, Ramsay was oddly calm as he repeated the story of his mother simply leaving. Second, he was in the process of attempting to clean the carpets, an activity that struck the relative as bizarre and deeply suspicious under the circumstances. The family's worst fears were now taking shape. They immediately filed an official missing person report with the St. Clair Shores Police Department. Donna Scrivo was now officially missing, and as detectives in her hometown began their investigation, Another, far more gruesome one, was just beginning about 30 miles to the north. On that very same day, January 31st, a man was driving along the side of a rural road in St. Clair County. He was near the Fredmore Highway exit off of I-94. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something out of place. A cluster of black plastic garbage bags carelessly tossed into the snowy, overgrown brush on the side of the road. It was an illegal dumping site, not uncommon, but something about it felt off. His curiosity piqued. He pulled over and called the police. When St. Clair County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they approached the bags with caution. As they cut open the first one, the frigid January air was filled with a stench that was unmistakable. The contents were the beginning of a waking nightmare. Inside the bags were human remains. Not a body, but pieces of a body. Dismembered, severed limbs, carefully wrapped in plastic sheeting and a bedspread. It was a scene of shocking brutality, yet it had a cold, clinical feel. The cuts were clean. This was not a crime of passion. It was a disposal, an attempt to erase a person. But there was no head, no torso, no hands, no immediate way to identify the victim. The investigators scanned the remains for any distinguishing marks. They found one. On one of the limbs there was a small, simple tattoo of a banjo. As the deputies were securing this horrific scene, another call came in. Miles away in China Township, a resident had discovered more bags. Then another call from yet another location. It became terrifyingly clear what was happening. Someone was driving through the county, leaving a trail of human remains, scattering a life across the frozen landscape like garbage. County Sheriff's Office was now at the center of a major homicide investigation, one that would be known locally as the body parts case. They had a victim, but no name. They had a horrific crime, but no suspect and no motive. Their first and most crucial task was to identify the victim. They immediately issued a BOLO, a be on the lookout, to all law enforcement agencies in southeastern Michigan. The alert detailed the discovery of the remains of a white female and included the one unique clue they had: the banjo tattoo. Back in St. Clair Shores, detectives were now treating Donna Scrivo's disappearance as a high-risk case. The story Ramsay was telling simply didn't add up. As they gathered information about Donna, a crucial detail emerged. They learned about her relationship with her sons, about Ramsay's struggles with mental illness, and about her unwavering support for him. A family member mentioned that Ramsay was a musician, that he played the banjo, and that Donna, in a touching display of motherly love and solidarity, had recently gotten a small banjo tattoo to honor him. The bulletin from St. Clair County landed on a detective's desk. Dismembered female remains. A banjo tattoo. The connection was instantaneous and sickening. The two separate investigations, launched 30 miles apart, snapped together like pieces of a puzzle, revealing a picture of absolute horror. The St. Clair Shores police now had every reason to believe that their missing person, Donna Scrivo, was the victim in the body parts case, and their primary person of interest was the man who was with her when she disappeared, the man who was cleaning the carpets, the man whose banjo playing she had honored with a tattoo. Her son, Ramsay. The investigation now moved with lightning speed. A search warrant was obtained for Donna and Ramsay's condo. The moment detectives stepped inside, their suspicions were confirmed. The air was thick with the overpowering, acrid smell of bleach and chemical cleaners. It was the smell of a cover-up, a desperate, frantic attempt to scrub away a terrible sin. To the naked eye, the condo looked clean. Too clean. But modern forensics can see what the naked eye cannot. The crime scene unit brought in luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin. When sprayed on a surface where blood has been, even if it has been thoroughly cleaned, it produces an eerie, ghostly blue glow in the dark. The detectives turned off the lights and began to spray. The condo's bathroom transformed into a scene from a horror film. It lit up. Not just a spot here or there, The entire room glowed. The floor, the walls, the ceiling. There was blood spatter cast across almost every surface, indicating a violent struggle or a high-velocity impact. But the epicenter, the focal point of the carnage, was the bathtub. It glowed with a terrifying intensity. This was not just where Donna Scrivo had been killed. This was where her body had been desecrated. It was a makeshift abattoir. The evidence told a silent, screaming story of what had happened within those four walls. While the forensic team processed the condo, other investigators were building a timeline of Ramsay's movements in the days following his mother's disappearance. They began pulling surveillance footage from businesses all over the area. And on January 27th, 2 days after Donna was last seen alive, they found him. The footage was from a Kmart store just a few miles from the condo. The video was mundane yet utterly chilling. It shows Ramsay Scrivo entering the store and walking purposefully through the aisles with a shopping cart. He bypasses the groceries, the clothing, the electronics. He heads straight for the hardware department. The camera follows him as he browses the selection of power tools. He stops. He examines a box. He lifts it and places it in his cart. It was a 14-inch electric limb and branch saw, a reciprocating saw. He proceeds to the checkout, pays for the saw, and leaves the store. The pieces were now falling into a grotesque and heartbreaking order. The prosecution began to construct its theory of the crime. They believed that on or around January 25th, Ramsay Scrivo, likely in the midst of a severe psychotic episode, attacked his mother inside their home. They theorized that he first incapacitated her. A later toxicology report on Donna's remains would reveal the presence of Xanax and Ambien, both powerful sedatives. Xanax was a medication that had been prescribed to Ramsay. He drugged the mother who was trying to care for him. Then he strangled her to death. But the horror did not end with her last breath. For several days, Ramsay lived in the condo with his mother's body. Then, using the reciprocating saw he had purchased from Kmart, he took her body into the bathroom, placed her in the tub, and began the gruesome, methodical task of dismembering her. He then carefully wrapped her remains, placed them in garbage bags, loaded them into a vehicle, and drove north. Under the cover of darkness, he drove along the quiet highways and back roads of St. Clair County, tossing the bags out of his car one by one, scattering the woman who gave him life across the frozen landscape, hoping she would never be found, never be identified. It was a plan that was both a product of a diseased mind and, chillingly, a product of cold, calculated logic. Ramsay Scrivo was brought in for questioning. He sat across from seasoned detectives, men and women who had seen the worst of humanity. But Ramsay was different. He was a portrait of absolute detachment. He was calm. He was articulate. He showed no grief for his missing mother, no worry, no fear for himself. He was a placid lake on the surface, concealing an abyss below. He stuck to his story. His mother packed a bag and left. He had no idea where she was. He answered every question with a dispassionate lie. But the evidence was a tidal wave, and his lies were a sandcastle. The blood in the condo that glowed blue, the receipt for the saw, the Kmart security footage, and the undeniable fact that the dismembered body with the banjo tattoo was his mother. Ramsay Scrivo was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder, mutilation of a corpse, and concealing a death. The news of the crime sent shockwaves through St. Clair Shores and the entire Detroit metropolitan area. The story was a fixture on the local news, the details growing more horrific with each report. The community was left to grapple with an unanswerable question. How? How could a son do this to his mother? How could such a thing happen in their town? In a quiet condo complex where people walked their dogs and said hello to their neighbors. The case was a media firestorm, not just because of its sheer brutality, but because of the profoundly complex psychological questions it raised. Was Ramsay Scrivo a monster, a cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what he was doing? Or was he a tragic figure? A man so hopelessly lost to the labyrinth of severe mental illness that he was no longer the captain of his own ship, no longer responsible for his actions? This question would be the central battleground of his trial. The legal proceedings that followed were as bizarre and unsettling as the crime itself. Ramsay's courtroom demeanor only amplified the sense that he was operating in a different reality from everyone else. He often wore a strange, ill-fitting white mask over the lower half of his face, creating a ghoulish, anonymous visage. He would mumble to himself during testimony. His eyes would dart around the courtroom as if tracking things that were invisible to all others. At times, he would have outbursts, shouting nonsensically, forcing the judge to call a recess. His defense team, led by public defender Tim Barkovich, was faced with an impossible task. The evidence that Ramsay had killed and dismembered his mother was overwhelming and undeniable. There was no whodunit aspect to this case, so they pursued the only defense available to them: legal insanity. Their argument was that Ramsay, at the moment he killed his mother, was so consumed by his schizoaffective disorder, so detached from reality, that he was incapable of understanding the nature of his actions, or that they were morally and legally wrong. He was, in the eyes of the law, they would argue, insane. The defense meticulously built a case designed to illustrate Ramsay's tragic and complete mental collapse. They called psychiatrists to the stand who testified at length about his diagnosis. They explained to the jury the terrifying symptoms of his illness, the auditory and visual hallucinations, the deeply entrenched paranoid delusions. They focused on his obsession with the cult. This wasn't just a quirk. It was the lens through which he saw the entire world. The defense's narrative was a heartbreaking one. In Ramsay Scrivo's fractured mind, he did not kill his loving, caring mother, Donna. He killed an imposter. He killed a member of the sinister cult who had taken on his mother's form to get close to him, to harm him. In his reality, the act was not murder. It was self-defense. It was the elimination of a mortal threat. To support this, they called family members and friends to testify. Through tears, they recounted Ramsay's descent. They spoke of the bright, promising young man he used to be, and contrasted that with the frightened, erratic, and sometimes terrifying man he had become. They detailed Donna's tireless, desperate efforts to get him help. They spoke of her constant fear, but also of her refusal to have him committed against his will, her undying hope that she could somehow reach the son she knew was still buried somewhere inside. It was a portrait of a family completely and utterly destroyed by the wrecking ball of mental illness. The prosecution, led by the formidable Macomb County Assistant Prosecutor William Cataldo, presented a starkly different interpretation of the facts. Cataldo did not dispute that Ramsay Scrivo was mentally ill. That was an undeniable fact. But he drew a sharp, clear line between being mentally ill and being legally insane. The prosecution's case was built on the evidence of planning, premeditation, and most importantly, consciousness of guilt. They argued that Ramsay's actions before, during, and after the murder were not the actions of a man completely untethered from reality. They were the actions of a man who knew he had done something terribly wrong and was now trying to get away with it. They began with the sedatives found in Donna's system. He drugged his mother. That, Cataldo argued, was not a spontaneous act of a psychotic break. That was a plan. That was intent to incapacitate his victim. Then, they played the Kmart surveillance video for the jury. They watched Ramsay's calm, methodical selection of the saw. He wasn't agitated. He wasn't ranting about a cult. He was a man on a mission, calmly purchasing the tool he would use to commit an unspeakable act. And then there was the cover-up. The meticulous cleaning of the bathroom with bleach. The attempt to shampoo the carpets. The dismemberment itself, which Cataldo argued was not a random act of psychosis, but a cold, logical, albeit gruesome attempt to make the body easier to transport and harder to identify. And the final act, driving for miles to scatter the remains in different locations. Why do that, the prosecution asked, if you don't understand that you've done something wrong? Why try to hide the evidence if you believe your actions were justified? These, Cataldo thundered, were the actions of a guilty mind. Prosecutor Cataldo's closing argument was a masterclass in prosecutorial strategy. He walked the jury through the evidence, piece by damning piece. He acknowledged the tragedy of Ramsay's mental illness. He expressed sympathy for a family torn apart. But he kept returning to one central point. He looked at the jury and said, "The question for you is not whether Ramsay Scrivo is mentally ill. We all agree that he is. The question the law asks you to answer is this: did he know that what he was doing was wrong? When he bought that saw, did he know it was wrong? When he cleaned that bathroom with bleach, did he know it was wrong? When he drove his mother's remains around the county and threw them away like trash, did he know that what he was doing was wrong?" The jury, a panel of 12 ordinary citizens, was now faced with an extraordinary and terrible responsibility. They had to sift through the horrific, gut-wrenching details of the crime. They had to listen to complex psychiatric testimony, and ultimately, they had to make a judgment about the state of a man's soul at the moment he took his own mother's life. They filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The court waited. The family waited. The media waited. The deliberation was expected to take days. It took just over an hour. A long, tense pause in the narration. The background music fades to almost complete silence. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces grim and unreadable. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreman. The room was silent, thick with anticipation. The clerk read the verdict. On the charge of mutilation of a corpse, guilty. On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder, guilty. But there was a crucial addendum, a finding that spoke to the complexities of the case. The jury also found Ramsay Scrivo guilty but mentally ill. In the state of Michigan, this verdict occupies a unique legal space. It is not an acquittal by reason of insanity. It is a guilty verdict. It affirms that the defendant, despite suffering from a substantial mental disorder, still possessed the capacity to understand that their actions were wrong. It meant that Ramsay Scrivo would not be sent to a state psychiatric facility to be treated and potentially released one day if deemed cured. It meant he was going to prison. He would receive mental health treatment within the prison system. But he would serve out his sentence just like any other convicted murderer. The sentencing hearing was a final, heartbreaking coda to the tragedy. It was the family's chance to face the man who had ripped a hole in their lives. Donna Scrivo's brother, Dan, and her older son, Jason, stood before the court to deliver their victim impact statements. Their voices thick with emotion, they spoke of the woman they had lost. They didn't speak of a victim. They spoke of Donna, the dedicated nurse, the loving sister, the funny aunt, the mother who was the unshakable foundation of their family. They spoke of the void she left behind, a silence that could never be filled. And then they spoke directly to Ramsay, who sat at the defense table, impassive, emotionless, hidden behind his strange white mask. Dan, his voice breaking, recalled the last conversation he had with his sister about Ramsay's deteriorating condition. He looked at his nephew, the boy he had watched grow up, and repeated Donna's final, prophetic promise. "She told me, I'm going to get him the help he needs, or I'm going to die trying. She died trying, Ramsay." He wept. "She died trying to help you." When the judge asked Ramsay if he wished to make a statement, he stood up. He offered no words of remorse, no apology, no explanation. Instead, he launched into a bizarre, rambling monologue, a stream of consciousness diatribe about the cult, about conspiracies, about being a target. It was a final, chilling glimpse into the shattered landscape of his mind. The judge, having heard all he needed to hear, imposed the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Michigan. Life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Justice, as defined by the legal system, had been served. Ramsay Scrivo was removed from society to spend the remainder of his days in a cell, but the case leaves behind a profound and unsettling legacy. It is a story with no victory, no catharsis, only victims. Donna Scrivo is the most tragic victim, a mother murdered by the very son she dedicated her life to saving. But in a different, more complex way, Ramsay Scrivo is also a victim of a catastrophic illness that hijacked his brain, erased his personality, and transformed him into a monster capable of the ultimate betrayal. And the entire Scrivo family are victims, left to navigate a grief so layered and complicated it defies description. How do you mourn the loss of your mother while knowing her killer is your own brother? How do you reconcile the loving boy you once knew with the man who committed an act of such unspeakable evil? The case of Ramsay Scrivo is also a searing indictment of the profound challenges and failings within America's mental health care system. Donna did everything a person could do. She recognized the illness. She sought professional help. She tried to manage his medication. She provided a home for him, but she was ultimately left alone to manage a crisis that was far beyond her control. The system is often a frustrating and difficult labyrinth for families to navigate, especially when dealing with an adult patient who has the right to refuse treatment. It leaves parents and loved ones in an impossible, terrifying limbo, watching someone they love spiral out of control, powerless to intervene until it's too late. They become caretakers, crisis managers, and too often, victims themselves. This story is a brutal, cautionary tale. It is a stark reminder that severe mental illness is not a weakness of character. It is a profound and devastating brain disease. And like any terminal illness, if left inadequately treated, it can have fatal consequences. Not just for the person who is sick, but for everyone around them. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our societal responsibility to care for our most vulnerable and the tragic price that is paid when that care falls short. Today, Ramsay Scrivo lives out his days within the concrete and steel of the Michigan Department of Corrections. He is a prisoner in two senses, locked away by the state and forever trapped within the inescapable prison of his own mind. The condo on Cove Street, the place that was once a home and became a slaughterhouse, was eventually cleaned, repaired, and sold. New residents live there now, likely unaware of the horror that transpired in their bathroom. The street is quiet once more. The rhythms of suburban life have resumed. But for the family that was shattered, for the investigators who can never unsee what they saw, and for the community whose sense of security was irrevocably broken, the memory of Donna Scrivo's life and the horror of her death will never fade. It serves as a permanent, ghostly reminder that the deepest darkness doesn't always come from the outside world. Sometimes it grows from within, born from a sickness in the mind and a mother's love that, in the face of an impossible storm, was tragically, heartbreakingly, not enough. The twisted case of Ramsay Scrivo is more than just a shocking true crime narrative. It is a profound human tragedy that resonates on multiple levels. It's a story about the boundaries of unconditional love and the point at which a mother's devotion becomes a danger to herself. It's about the devastating power of an illness that can warp reality, sever the most sacred of bonds, and turn a place of supposed sanctuary into a house of unimaginable horrors. It is a story that should haunt us. It should force us to look closer at the silent struggles unfolding all around us, and to question whether the quiet covenants of our suburban lives are truly keeping us safe, or just blinding us to the darkness that can lie hidden, waiting, just on the other side of a neighbor's door.